The California coastline stretched endlessly beneath the afternoon sun, waves crashing against jagged cliffs, while seagulls danced overhead in lazy circles. High above the Pacific Ocean, perched on one of the most expensive bluffs in the state, stood a house that spoke of dreams fulfilled and battles won. Glass walls reflected the endless blue horizon. Stone pathways wound through carefully planted gardens. Every detail whispered of peace, of sanctuary, of a man who had finally found his quiet corner of the world. Inside this temple of tranquility, Mike Tyson moved like a ghost through his own home. His bare feet made no sound against the polished concrete floors. The only noises came from distant jazz music drifting from hidden speakers and the gentle click of dog claws as two massive companions roamed freely through the open spaces. Pharaoh, the older and wiser of the two, followed close behind his master with the loyalty of a guardian. Leon, younger and more alert, patrolled the floor-to-ceiling windows with the instincts of a soldier who never truly leaves his post. This was not the Mike Tyson the world remembered. Gone were the roaring crowds and flashing cameras. Gone were the gloves that once carried the weight of a generation's hopes and fears. Gone were the microphones thrust into his face, demanding explanations for every breath, every step, every moment of existence. Here, in this palace of glass and silence, he was simply a man approaching 60 who had paid dearly for the privilege of breathing without judgment. The backyard stretched before him like a minimalist painting come to life. Clean lines cut through the landscape with mathematical precision. A pool reflected the sky like a shard of fallen heaven. Slate tiles warmed under his feet as he stepped outside, followed faithfully by his four-legged companions. A single teak lounge chair waited beside a table holding a glass of lemon water, condensation beating in the California heat. Mike lowered himself into the chair and let the sun kiss his chest. His body, though aged by decades of punishment, still carried the thick muscle memory of wars fought with sweat and determination. These were not battles waged with bullets or bombs, but with fists and fury, and the kind of pain that carves itself into a man's soul one blow at a time. Every scar told a story. Every line on his face marked a victory or defeat that had brought him to this moment of hard-earned peace. For 3 perfect days, this was his world. Morning runs along the coastal path as dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and pink. Afternoon stretches on the warm slate as the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility. Evening sits by the pool as the sun melted into the Pacific, turning the water into liquid fire. It was everything he had dreamed of during those long nights in hotel rooms, everything he had promised himself during the darkest moments when fame felt more like a prison than a gift. But paradise has a way of attracting snakes. It started with a feeling, the kind of sensation that lives in the space between instinct and awareness. During his evening jog along the curved driveway, Mike first noticed a figure standing perfectly still beside a mailbox. The man appeared to be in his 60s, with stiff posture and arms folded across his chest like a judge waiting to pass sentence. Dark sunglasses reflected the dying light, hiding eyes that seemed to measure everything they saw. Mike offered a polite nod as he jogged past. Nothing came back. No acknowledgement, no greeting, just the steady gaze of someone watching, waiting, calculating. It was the kind of attention that felt wrong, like a discordant note in a perfect symphony. But Mike had been stared at before. His face, his name, his very presence carried electricity that made some people freeze and others flee. He thought nothing more of it and continued his run, breathing in the ocean air that tasted like freedom. The next evening brought the same silent sentinel. This time, Mike was tending to his small herb garden, watering the lavender and basil he had planted with his own hands. The simple act of nurturing something beautiful from the earth brought him a joy he had never found in any ring. As he moved the hose from plant to plant, that familiar feeling crept up his spine again. The sensation of being watched, studied, measured. He turned slowly, following instincts honed by years of sensing danger from every angle. There stood the same man, pretending to examine a bush near the white fence that divided their properties. But his eyes betrayed his true purpose. They were locked on Mike's shoulders, his arms, his hands, cataloging every detail like a predator studying prey. Their gazes met across the hedge. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then the stranger looked away, plucking at a dead leaf as if that had been his intention all along. But the mask had slipped. The pretense had cracked. Mike turned off the hose and walked inside, his mind already working, already preparing for something he hoped would never come. That night, he paced through his house like a caged animal suddenly remembering the weight of bars. Pharaoh sensed the tension and stayed close, while Leon positioned himself by the sliding door, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dogs knew. Animals always know when the air changes, when peace begins to curdle into something darker. Mike stood in his living room, looking up at the slowly turning ceiling fan, and felt the old familiar heat beginning to build in his chest. He had walked away from violence. He had turned his back on the cameras and the crowds, and the crushing weight of a life lived in constant defense. But some instincts never truly sleep. A predator recognizes when he is being hunted, even in his own sanctuary. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Mike's driveway as he bent into his daily stretch routine. Cool ocean air rolled over the stone pavers, carrying the promise of another perfect California day. Sweat beaded on his collar as he reached for his toes, feeling the familiar pull in his hamstrings that reminded him his body was still strong, still capable, still ready for whatever life might demand. The world around him breathed with peaceful rhythm. Birds called from the eucalyptus trees. Waves crashed against distant cliffs. His breathing synchronized with the morning silence, finding that perfect balance between effort and ease that had taken him decades to master. This was meditation in motion, prayer without words, the kind of spiritual practice that money could never buy, but suffering had finally taught him to embrace. Then a voice sliced through the quiet, like a blade through silk. "You still dressing up like an athlete, huh?" Mike straightened slowly, every muscle in his body shifting from relaxation to readiness without conscious thought. At the end of his driveway stood the watcher, the silent sentinel who had haunted his evening runs. But now the man was speaking, and his words carried the unmistakable tone of someone looking for a fight. The stranger's arms were folded across his chest in a pose of manufactured authority. His smirk was tight and ugly, the kind of expression that said he had been planning this moment, rehearsing these words, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. A beer can rested on the ground beside him, despite the early hour. "My ex-wife used to run around in gym clothes," the man continued, his voice growing louder with each word. "Didn't make her any stronger." Mike remained perfectly still, his face a mask of controlled calm. But inside, ancient alarms were sounding. This was not casual conversation. This was provocation, pure and calculated. The man was testing boundaries, probing for weakness, searching for the exact pressure point that would trigger a reaction. "Nice house." The stranger pressed on, gesturing toward Mike's sanctuary with mock admiration. "Guess you hit the jackpot, huh?" His eyes glittered with malicious intent. "Houses like this don't usually go to guys like you." The final words hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the morning peace. There it was, the real message wrapped in casual cruelty. The assumption, the judgment, the barely disguised hatred that some people carry in their hearts like a loaded weapon, waiting for the right moment to fire. Mike said nothing. He simply turned and walked back toward his house, his fists remaining unclenched despite every instinct screaming for violence. But in his chest, a slow burn began to curl and grow. It was not rage, not yet. It was something deeper and more dangerous. It was the awakening of a warrior who thought he had found peace, only to discover that some battles follow you home. Days passed in mounting tension. The man, whose name Mike learned was Ted Marshall, abandoned all pretense of neighborly behavior. He appeared constantly at the fence line, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, phone always in hand. His presence became a dark cloud over Mike's morning runs and evening meditation. Every moment of peace was poisoned by the knowledge that hostile eyes were watching, measuring, judging. Ted's provocations grew bolder by the day. He made loud comments about property values when Mike walked past. He pointed his phone camera directly at the house during Mike's pool time. He muttered just loudly enough to be heard about people who don't belong and strangers in the neighborhood. Each word was carefully chosen, each gesture precisely calculated to inflame, without quite crossing the line, into actionable harassment. Mike's gardener, a quiet man named Javier, eventually provided the missing piece of the puzzle. "Mr. Tyson," he said quietly one afternoon, eyes darting nervously toward Ted's house. "That man over there keeps a log, watches everything, calls and violations. He's very particular about people who aren't like him." The truth settled into Mike's consciousness, like a stone dropping into still water. This was not random hostility. This was systematic, methodical prejudice dressed up as concerned citizenship. Ted Marshall had appointed himself the unofficial guardian of neighborhood purity, and Mike's presence represented everything he feared and despised. Things escalated rapidly after that revelation. Garbage bins at the edge of Mike's driveway were mysteriously knocked over twice in 1 week. The landscaping truck that serviced his property received anonymous complaints about parking violations. Small acts of petty sabotage began appearing like weeds in a carefully maintained garden. Then came the Wednesday afternoon confrontation that changed everything. Mike was walking back from his daily run with Pharaoh and Leon trotting beside him when Ted appeared at the property line again. But this time he was not content to watch from a distance. He leaned against the low white wall that separated their homes, his mouth twisted into something between a sneer and a smile. "You're always training," he called out, his voice pitched to carry across the space between them. "Afraid you'll lose your edge, champ." Mike continued walking, refusing to take the bait. But Ted was not finished. "Don't see many people your age walking around shirtless," he added with calculated cruelty. "Trying to hold on to something?" For the first time since this harassment began, Mike stopped walking. He turned to face his tormentor directly, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You ever get tired of pretending to water dead plants just to spy on your neighbors?" Ted's confident smirk faltered. The tables had turned in an instant. The hunter had become the hunted, and suddenly the game did not seem quite so entertaining. Mike resumed his walk toward the house, leaving Ted standing alone at the fence with his manufactured outrage and his can of beer. But both men knew that something fundamental had shifted. The silent phase of this conflict was over. Words had been exchanged. Lines had been drawn. That night, Mike stood at his living room window, watching moonlight reflect off the pool surface. Pharaoh curled up by the door, while Leon paced restlessly, sensing the change in atmospheric pressure that comes before every storm. Mike checked his security cameras methodically, ensuring every angle was covered and every feed was recording properly. His instincts, honed by decades of surviving in hostile environments, told him that Ted Marshall was building towards something bigger than petty harassment. The moment was coming. Mike could feel it in his bones, in the way the air seemed to thicken with possibility. He had spent his entire life preparing for battles, and now another one was approaching his doorstep. This time, though, the stakes were different. This was not about championships or glory or fame. This was about the fundamental right to exist peacefully in his own space. As he finally turned away from a window, Mike caught a glimpse of Ted's house across the street. A light was on in an upstairs window, and a silhouette moved behind the curtain. The man was awake, planning, scheming, preparing for whatever came next. Two predators circled each other across a suburban street, each waiting for the other to make the first decisive move. But only one of them was a professional fighter who had spent his entire life learning how to turn defense into victory. The heat had grown thick and oppressive in the days following Mike's first direct confrontation with Ted Marshall. It was the kind of late summer wait that settles on everything like a warning, making the air itself feel hostile and electric. The Pacific still shimmered in the distance, but even the ocean breeze seemed unable to cut through the tension that had wrapped itself around the neighborhood like a suffocating blanket. Mike maintained his routine with military precision, but every moment felt charged with potential danger. His morning runs began before sunrise, feet pounding against asphalt as he pushed his body through familiar patterns of endurance and strength. Mid-morning brought resistance training in his private gym, sweat pouring as he moved iron that would challenge men half his age. Ice water with lemon, measured portions of carefully prepared food. A short swim as the sun reached its zenith, turning the pool into liquid diamonds. But none of it calmed the growing certainty in his gut that Ted Marshall was not merely a nosy neighbor with boundary issues. This was something colder, more calculated, more dangerous. The man had the patience of a hunter and the methodical nature of someone who had done this before. Every gesture, every comment, every moment of manufactured outrage felt like pieces of a larger strategy clicking into place. Ted no longer bothered with subterfuge. He appeared constantly at the fence line, positioned himself prominently on the sidewalk, stood in his front yard with arms crossed and eyes locked on Mike's property. The phone was always in his hand now, sometimes raised as if recording, sometimes pressed to his ear as he spoke in animated tones to unknown listeners. Whatever game he was playing, the rules were becoming clear. Mike had encountered men like Ted before, though not usually in neighborhoods like this. He had seen them in boardrooms where contracts were negotiated, in courtrooms where justice was decided by men who looked like Ted and thought like Ted and believed with absolute certainty that the world belonged to people like Ted. They were the gatekeepers of invisible boundaries, the self-appointed guardians of spaces they had never officially been asked to protect. Their weapon was not violence, at least not directly. Their weapon was the system itself, the network of assumptions and prejudices and quiet understandings that could be activated with a simple phone call. They knew which numbers to dial, which words to use, which fears to trigger in the minds of people who carried badges and made split-second decisions about who belonged where and who represented a threat. The pattern of harassment intensified with surgical precision. First came the landscaping truck incident. For months, Javier's team had parked across the street while servicing Mike's property, never blocking traffic or causing problems. But suddenly, anonymous complaints began flooding the city's parking violation hotline. The truck received official warnings, then fines, then threats of towing. Javier apologetically explained that they might need to park several blocks away and walk their equipment to the house. Then the garbage bins began their mysterious dance. Twice in 1 week, the containers Mike placed carefully at the curb were knocked over during the night, spilling refuse across the pristine street. No security camera caught the perpetrator, but the message was clear. Even the most mundane aspects of neighborhood life could be weaponized by someone with sufficient patience and malice. These were not random acts of vandalism. They were pressure points being tested, boundaries being probed, the careful application of force designed to create maximum frustration while maintaining plausible deniability. Mike recognized the strategy because he had seen it used against others throughout his career. Death by 1,000 cuts. The slow erosion of peace through relentless, petty aggression. On a Wednesday afternoon that would later be remembered as the turning point, Mike was walking back toward his house with Pharaoh and Leon flanking him like loyal soldiers when Ted made his most brazen move yet. Instead of maintaining his usual distance at the fence line, he was leaning against the low white wall that separated their properties, his body language screaming confrontation. "You're always training," Ted called out, his voice pitched to carry maximum insult. "Afraid you'll lose your edge, champ." The word champ was delivered with such dripping sarcasm that it transformed what might have been a compliment into a slur. Mike kept walking, refusing to give Ted the reaction he was clearly seeking. But the man was not finished with his performance. "Don't see many people your age walking around shirtless," Ted continued, his voice growing louder and more aggressive, trying to hold on to something that's already gone. For the first time since this harassment campaign began, Mike stopped walking. He turned to face Ted directly, his voice calm but carrying undertones that promised consequences. "You ever get tired of pretending to water dead plants just to spy on your neighbors?" Ted's confident smirk cracked like a mask struck by lightning. The predator had suddenly become prey, and the shift in power dynamics was visible from across the street. This was not the reaction he had expected or prepared for. Mike Tyson was not intimidated. Mike Tyson was not backing down. Mike Tyson was, in fact, calling him out directly. The confrontation lasted only seconds, but it changed everything. Mike resumed his walk to the house, while Ted stood frozen at the fence, his manufactured outrage deflating like a punctured balloon. Both men understood that a line had been crossed, that the silent phase of their conflict was officially over. That night, the atmosphere in Mike's house felt different, heavier. more electric with possibility. He poured himself a glass of ice water and positioned himself by the living room window, watching moonlight turn the pool into a mirror of liquid silver. Pharaoh curled up by the sliding door, while Leon paced restlessly between the windows, his instincts picking up signals that humans might miss. Mike checked his security system with the thoroughness of a man who had learned to trust paranoia over optimism. Every camera was functioning perfectly. Every angle was covered. Every feed was recording continuously and backing up to cloud storage that would survive whatever might come next. He had invested heavily in this technology, not out of fear, but out of experience. He knew that in conflicts like this, the truth often belonged to whoever had the best evidence. The dogs were unsettled, pacing and whining in ways that reminded Mike of the hours before thunderstorms. Animals possessed senses that evolution had sharpened to detect danger before it became visible to human perception. Their agitation confirmed what his own instincts were already screaming. Something was building toward a climax. As he finally turned away from the window, Mike caught sight of Ted's house across the street. Lights were on in multiple rooms, despite the late hour. Shadows moved behind curtains. The man was clearly awake, clearly active, clearly engaged in some kind of planning or preparation that required his full attention. The next afternoon brought the moment Mike had been anticipating with equal measures of dread and readiness. He was in the middle of a seated stretch on his back patio, sweat gleaming on his arms from an intensive resistance workout, when he spotted Ted pacing frantically across the street, phone pressed to his ear like a weapon. This was different from Ted's usual performances. His body language screamed urgency rather than manufactured outrage. He was pointing directly at Mike's house, gesturing wildly, his mouth moving in rapid, animated speech. Whoever was on the other end of that phone call was receiving a very specific message about a very specific situation. Mike stood slowly, every muscle in his body shifting from relaxation to readiness. He took a step closer to the edge of his patio and narrowed his eyes, trying to read the situation from across the hedge. Ted's face was flushed with excitement rather than anger. This was not harassment. This was activation. Then Mike heard it, the unmistakable sound of authority approaching. Tires on gravel, slow and heavy and measured. Not a delivery truck or a neighbor's casual visit. This was the sound of official business, of uniforms and badges, and the kind of power that could transform a man's sanctuary into a crime scene with nothing more than suspicion and paperwork. Two black and white cruisers rounded the bend in perfect formation, moving toward his gate with the deliberate precision of predators who had already decided their prey was guilty. Mike whistled sharply, and both dogs responded instantly. Pharaoh rose to his full imposing height, while Leon flanked Mike's other side, both animals reading the shift in their master's posture and preparing themselves for whatever came next. Mike moved toward the side gate with controlled calm, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood his system. Every step was measured, every movement calculated to project authority rather than aggression. He reached the metal latch just as the cruisers came to a stop in front of his home. Two officers emerged from their vehicles, like actors stepping onto a stage they had rehearsed for many times before. The first was a bulky man with sun-scorched skin and a permanent scowl carved into his face. His badge identified him as Sergeant Richard Graves. The second was younger and leaner, with close-cropped dark hair and the nervous energy of someone still learning his role. Officer Owen Hart. They exchanged a quick glance that spoke volumes about their expectations and assumptions. Then they turned toward Mike's property with the confidence of men who believed that badges granted them automatic access to any space they deemed worthy of investigation. They did not ring the bell. They did not announce themselves. They did not pause to consider that they might be making a mistake. They simply opened the gate and stepped directly onto Mike Tyson's private property as if they owned it. The trap had been sprung perfectly. The moment the officers stepped through Mike's gate without invitation, the air itself seemed to crystallize around them. What had been a quiet California afternoon transformed instantly into something electric and dangerous, charged with the kind of tension that makes smart men careful and foolish men reckless. These two officers, responding to Ted Marshall's carefully orchestrated phone call, had just crossed a line they did not even realize existed. Pharaoh's low growl rumbled through the afternoon silence, like distant thunder. Leon positioned himself slightly ahead of Mike, hackles raised, reading the threat level with animal instincts that never lied. Both dogs understood what their human companion knew from decades of experience. Predators reveal themselves through their approach, and these men were approaching like predators. "Hands where I can see them," Sergeant Graves barked immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward his holster. The command came before any greeting, before any identification, before any attempt to understand what situation they were actually confronting. It was the reflex of a man who had already decided that Mike Tyson was a problem to be solved rather than a citizen to be served. Mike remained perfectly still, his arms already crossed in plain view. His voice carried the calm authority of someone who had faced down much more dangerous opponents than these two. "I live here," he said simply, each word clear and measured. "We got a report of a trespasser," Officer Hart added, his younger voice carrying traces of uncertainty that his partner lacked. His eyes darted between Mike's imposing presence and the obvious wealth surrounding them. The house, the pool, the meticulously maintained landscape all spoke of legitimate ownership, but their caller had been very specific about the threat they would find. "You're not supposed to be here," Hart continued, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow and rehearsed. Mike's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You didn't even ask for ID," he observed, his tone carrying just enough edge to cut through their assumptions without crossing into aggression. Graves scoffed with the dismissive arrogance of someone who had never been challenged on private property before. "Sir, we're not debating this. You'll come with us while we verify your story. You can show your identification at the station." The suggestion hung in the air like an insult wrapped in official procedure. Here was a man standing in his own backyard, surrounded by his own possessions, beside his own pool, and these officers were demanding he prove his right to exist in this space by submitting to arrest and transportation to their facility. "No," Mike replied with quiet finality. "You can verify it right here." That single word, delivered with the unshakable confidence of someone who knew his rights and intended to exercise them, changed the entire dynamic of the encounter. Graves had expected compliance, submission, the kind of automatic deference that his uniform usually commanded. Instead, he was facing resistance from someone who clearly understood that badges did not grant unlimited authority. Graves stepped forward aggressively, his training and instincts combining in the worst possible way. His hand shot out in a quick motion designed to grab and control, the kind of physical domination tactic that had worked for him countless times before against people who lacked the knowledge or confidence to resist. But Mike Tyson was not like anyone these officers had ever encountered. His body had been forged in gyms where survival depended on split-second reactions to incoming threats. His reflexes had been honed by decades of facing opponents who moved with lightning speed and devastating power. Graves' grab was fast for a civilian encounter, but laughably slow for someone who had dodged punches thrown by the fastest hands in boxing history. In one fluid motion that spoke of muscle memory older than conscious thought, Mike pivoted on his back foot, caught Graves' wrist with precise timing, and redirected the officer's momentum using his own aggressive energy against him. It was not a boxing technique or a street fighting move. It was pure physics applied with surgical precision, the kind of defensive maneuver that neutralizes an attack without causing unnecessary harm. Graves crashed to the slate tiles beside the pool with a winded grunt that echoed across the yard. His uniform was unripped, his body uninjured except for wounded pride, but his authority had been completely shattered by someone who understood the difference between necessary force and excessive violence. Officer Hart froze completely, his hand hovering near his equipment, but his brain struggling to process what had just occurred. His partner, the senior officer with years of experience, was lying on the ground beside a pool, having been deposited there with such casual efficiency that it looked almost choreographed. "Don't move," Hart shouted, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. Everything about this situation had gone wrong in ways their training had never prepared them for. Mike stood perfectly still, his hands open and visible, his posture non-threatening but unmistakably confident. "That," he said in a voice as calm as deep water, "was self-defense." The words carried absolute conviction because they were absolutely true. Every camera on the property had recorded Graves initiating physical contact. Every angle showed Mike responding with minimal necessary force to an unprovoked attack. Every frame of footage demonstrated textbook defensive action by a homeowner protecting himself from aggressive trespassers. Mike reached slowly toward a gym bag beside his chair, moving with deliberate transparency to avoid triggering Hart's obvious nervousness. He pulled out his wallet and opened it with the flourish of someone revealing a royal flush. Inside were all the documents that should have been requested before any hands were laid on anyone. California driver's license showing this address, deed to the house proving ownership, and a laminated certification card identifying him as Iron Mike Tyson, retired professional boxer and licensed athletic trainer. Then he raised his phone and tapped the screen. Multiple camera feeds blinked to life, showing the encounter from every possible angle. "You're being recorded," Mike informed them with quiet satisfaction, "and everything backs up to the cloud automatically." The technology was his insurance policy, but more than that, it was his weapon. In an age where truth often belonged to whoever had the best evidence, Mike had invested in cameras that would capture not just what happened, but the context that would make it impossible for anyone to spin the narrative in their favor. Graves groaned from his position beside the pool, one hand rubbing his shoulder where he had landed. The impact had been jarring but not damaging, precisely calibrated to end the threat without creating a medical emergency. "We were responding to a complaint," he mumbled, his authority deflating like a punctured tire. "No," Mike interrupted, his voice hardening to match his expression. "You were responding to a stereotype. A black man by a pool in a nice neighborhood, and you didn't ask a single question before reaching for me." The truth of that statement settled over the scene like a weight. These officers had arrived with assumptions already formed, decisions already made, actions already planned based on nothing more than a phone call from a neighbor who had weaponized their prejudices with surgical precision. Across the street, Ted Marshall had retreated behind his fence, but his silhouette was visible in the curtained window, watching his plan unfold in ways he had never intended. He had expected Mike to be arrested, removed, humiliated. Instead, he was witnessing the complete dismantling of everything he had tried to accomplish. Graves finally struggled to his feet and radioed for a supervisor, his voice subdued and professional in a way that suggested he understood how badly this encounter had gone wrong. Mike never lowered his gaze, never moved from his position, never gave an inch of ground in what had become a test of wills that would determine whether justice lived in his backyard or died under the weight of assumption and prejudice. The supervisor's arrival would bring new complications and new opportunities, but Mike Tyson had already won the most important victory. He had defended his home without throwing a single punch, protected his dignity without losing his composure, and demonstrated that some battles are won not through violence, but through the unshakable conviction that you belong exactly where you are standing. The cameras kept recording, the clouds kept backing up, and the truth kept growing stronger with every passing second. The aftermath of that confrontation beside Mike Tyson's pool spread through the digital world like wildfire racing across dry grass. What began as a private moment of injustice captured by security cameras became a global phenomenon that sparked conversations in living rooms, boardrooms, and courthouses across the nation. But Mike himself never intended for the footage to go public. He had forwarded the video to only 3 people: his attorney Angela Dorsey, his publicist Darnell, and a journalist friend named Elise, who had covered his comeback years earlier. Someone in that small circle had decided the world needed to see what happened when assumptions met reality. By sunrise the next morning, the clip was everywhere. Social media platforms exploded with reactions that ranged from outrage to incredulity to dark laughter at the absurdity of it all. Headlines screamed across news websites: "Mike Tyson mistaken for intruder at his own home." "Legendary boxer detains cop in self-defense." Security footage sparks national debate on profiling. The responses revealed the fracture lines running through American society. Some people saw the humor in officers trying to arrest one of the most recognizable athletes in history at his own mansion. Others focused on the deeper implications of what would have happened if the homeowner had been someone without cameras lawyers, and a household name. The hashtags told the story. Hashtag Tyson stand his ground. Hashtag you don't belong here. Hashtag justice by the pool. But for Mike, sitting at his kitchen counter as the sun painted golden streaks across his concrete floors, none of it felt like victory. He scrolled through messages from people he hadn't heard from in decades. Some offered support, others expressed anger. A few tried to make jokes about the situation. The question that appeared most frequently in his inbox was the one that kept him awake. How many times has this happened to people who didn't have your advantages? Angela arrived before noon, her heels clicking against the polished concrete as she entered carrying a leather binder thick with documentation. She wore her usual armor of professional competence, crisp slacks, sleeveless blouse, hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun that said she was ready for war. "You didn't ask for this," she said, setting the folder on his kitchen island. "But you just lit a fuse under every conversation about racial justice in America." Mike rubbed his palm across his scalp, feeling every year of his age in that simple gesture. "I didn't want a fuse. I wanted peace." Angela's expression softened slightly. "They brought the fire to your door, Mike. You just controlled how it burned." Outside, the first news vans were already parking along the tree-lined street. Reporters gathered behind Mike's closed gate, like modern-day siege engines, shouting questions toward windows that reflected nothing but sky. A drone hummed somewhere overhead, its cameras searching for angles that would feed the appetite of a world hungry for content. Pharaoh and Leon positioned themselves by the sliding glass doors, their instincts telling them that their territory was under a new kind of invasion. These intruders carried cameras instead of weapons, but the dogs understood that both could be used to cause harm. Mike closed the curtains, shutting out the visual noise, while his mind processed what came next. Across the street, Ted Marshall's house had gone dark. Curtains drawn, no movement visible, but Mike could feel the weight of the man's presence, like a storm cloud gathering strength. Ted had pulled a lever he couldn't control, started a fire he couldn't extinguish, and now he was learning what it meant to be the architect of your own destruction. The sheriff's department's official response arrived that afternoon, delivered through a press release, so sterile it could have been written by a computer. "The incident involving Sergeant Richard Graves and Officer Owen Hart is under review. No further comments at this time." Angela laughed bitterly when she read it aloud. That's bureaucratic language for, "We're praying this disappears." But disappearing was the last thing this story was going to do. By evening, Mike's footage had been dissected on every major news network. Legal analysts debated police procedures, civil rights groups issued statements of support, and athletes from every major sport began speaking out. The narrative had grown beyond Mike's control, beyond anyone's control, becoming something larger than the sum of its parts. That night, Mike stepped onto his patio under a canopy of stars that seemed brighter than usual. The pool glowed beneath subtle lighting, its surface disturbed only by the gentle California breeze. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to sit in the lounge chair where this entire confrontation had begun. Pharaoh and Leon arranged themselves around him like furry sentinels, their presence more comforting than any security system. He thought about the thousands of people who faced similar situations without his resources. No cameras to capture the truth, no lawyers to fight the system, no recognizable name to make the world pay attention. He thought about his own childhood in Brownsville, Brooklyn, where he had first been labeled dangerous before he ever threw a punch in anger. The weight of that realization settled into his bones like old pain awakening. The following morning brought Angela back to his door, this time carrying news that changed everything. "Both officers have been suspended pending investigation," she announced, spreading documents across his kitchen island like battle plans. But here's what makes this interesting. Their body cameras were turned off the entire time. Mike's jaw flexed with controlled anger. They turned them off deliberately, which means they knew they were crossing a line before they ever stepped onto your property, Angela confirmed. "They came here expecting trouble, planning to create it if necessary, and they disabled the evidence before they started." She placed a thick envelope on the counter. "The mayor's office is under serious pressure now. They're launching a citywide audit of police complaints, starting with every case these two officers have been involved in over the past 5 years. Your situation opened a door, Mike, and now other victims are walking through it. Across the street, Ted Marshall's reckoning was arriving in the form of a black SUV that pulled up to his gate that afternoon. Two plainclothes investigators emerged, followed by a man in a navy suit carrying sealed envelopes that looked like legal documents. They rang Ted's doorbell with the patience of people who were accustomed to uncomfortable conversations. Mike watched from his living room window as Ted emerged looking disheveled and defensive, clutching a beer can despite the early hour. The lead investigator handed him the first envelope, while the other man read from an official-looking document. Though Mike couldn't hear the words, he could read the body language of a man whose world was collapsing in real time. The charges were comprehensive: filing a false report, discriminatory harassment, endangering a civilian through misuse of emergency services. But the investigators weren't finished. They produced a second folder containing documented complaints from other neighbors, incidents that had been ignored until now because the victims lacked Mike's platform and resources. A Latina housekeeper who had been followed and questioned about her right to walk through the neighborhood. An interracial couple who had been demanded to show utility bills to prove their residency. A black teenager delivering groceries who had been threatened with police calls unless he provided identification. Ted Marshall had been running his own private campaign of intimidation for years, and Mike's cameras had finally provided the evidence needed to stop him. The final envelope contained a 30-day eviction notice. Official investigation pending, but the message was clear. His reign of neighborhood terror was ending. That evening, the mayor held a press conference that was broadcast live across the region. Standing behind a podium flanked by city flags, she delivered words that resonated far beyond the local community. This incident is not about one man, one house, or one badge. It represents a failure of the systems we trust to protect all citizens equally. What happened to Mr. Tyson was wrong, but it has illuminated problems that extend far beyond his property line. Mike stood behind his curtains, watching the broadcast with arms crossed and expression unreadable. He wasn't celebrating because he understood that individual justice was just the beginning. Real change would require sustained effort, continued vigilance, and the willingness to keep fighting battles he never wanted to fight. Over the following days, something unexpected began to happen. The neighborhood that had felt hostile just weeks before started showing signs of transformation. People who had previously avoided eye contact now offered cautious nods of acknowledgement. A man with a stroller raised his hand in greeting. A teenager across the street waved before getting into his car. It wasn't friendship, but it was recognition, and recognition was the foundation upon which respect could be built. Ted Marshall's house stood empty within a month, a sold sign replacing the surveillance post from which he had waged his campaign of harassment. Mike never asked who bought it, never inquired about the new owners, never gloated over his tormentor's departure. Some victories were measured not in the defeat of enemies, but in the restoration of peace. But perhaps the most significant moment came weeks later, when Mike received an invitation to speak at a local elementary school. Not as Mike Tyson the champion, not as the celebrity who had dominated headlines, but as a man who had defended his home without throwing a single punch. He accepted because he remembered being that age, remembered feeling powerless, remembered needing to see that strength could be expressed through restraint rather than violence. The library was small, filled with plastic chairs occupied by children between 10 and 14 years old. Mike stood before them in a simple gray sweater and jeans, no cameras recording, no reporters taking notes, just him and a group of young people who needed to hear that their worth was not determined by other people's comfort levels. He didn't talk about boxing or championships or fame. Instead, he spoke about walking into rooms where people had already decided you didn't belong, about the choice between shrinking under their gaze or standing tall in your own truth. His final words stayed with many of them long after they left the library. Your truth is stronger than their comfort. Remember that when the world tries to make you smaller. As autumn painted the California coast in shades of gold and amber, Mike Tyson returned to his evening routine by the pool. The Pacific stretched endlessly before him, waves catching the last light of day as they had for centuries before his arrival and would for centuries after his departure. Pharaoh and Leon sprawled around his chair, content and alert, guardians of a peace that had been tested and proven unbreakable. The security cameras still recorded everything, but their purpose had evolved from protection to prevention. The footage from that day beside the pool had become something more than evidence of his innocence. It had become proof that justice was possible when truth and preparation aligned with the courage to stand your ground. Mike sipped his lemon water and watched the sun melt into the horizon, painting the sky in colors that had no names. This was what he had fought for, had paid for, had earned through decades of battles both public and private. Not just the house or the view or the quiet, but the unshakable knowledge that he belonged exactly where he was sitting. The story that began with a stare and escalated to handcuffs had ended with something more valuable than victory. It had ended with the kind of peace that can only be achieved by those who are willing to defend it without compromise. Ted Marshall was gone, but more importantly, the message had been sent and received. This sanctuary would not be surrendered, this ground would not be ceded, and this peace would be protected by whatever means necessary. In the growing darkness, with stars beginning to pierce the California sky, Mike Tyson sat surrounded by the silence he had fought so hard to claim. It was perfect, it was earned, and it was finally, unquestionably his.